This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development by a group of guys with the one thing in common. We love Drupal. We record this live on Wednesday afternoons in a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 106, Wednesday, October 21st, 2015. Learn to code. Hey, guys.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How's everyone doing today?
Doing great.
That's good.
Doing good.
Great is a good way to be. So joining us, as usual, is John Picozzi from Oomph.
Howdy.
Howdy, John. Okay, a man of many words today. And also joining us is Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Design. Hey, Nick.
Good afternoon. Good to see you guys yesterday at the Drupal PVD meetup. Had a couple of good talks, and brief review of Drupal 8. Jason had a talk that I think we'll be having on the show coming up about optimization for images and performance. And then I gave a little preview of what Chef does outside of Drupal. So it was a good meetup. And then I lost miserably at ping pong several times in a row.
To who?
To John and Rob. It was pretty dramatic.
Really?
Yeah, it's been a while since I played. But it was fun. It was a good time.
Yeah, it's okay.
He scored more points than I thought he was going to.
Oh, wow. Well, that's the difference between someone who has a ping pong table in their, was it ping pong? Was it ping pong?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. They have that in their office and someone who doesn't. We could, if you wanted to, we could also talk about bowling.
Oh yeah, bowling is fun too.
We could talk about that, or not.
So how about if we skip the bowling talk, because we all went bowling last week, and we'll leave that alone. And how about if we actually talk about the big news from October 7th, because I don't think we've had a show since then, which is Drupal IRC1 is out. Hey, so did any of us predict October 7th? I don't think so.
Maybe one of the 4 or 5 times that we made predictions.
Right. Boy, didn't it feel so anticlimactic too? I
didn't even notice until a couple days later because there was no, all the documentation says that it has to have no critical issues for a week or 2, and there was a critical issue that morning. And then I checked on Friday, and sure enough, Drupal 8 RC1 was out.
So, in your opinion, is that a break to the documentation?
No, I think it's more of a general guideline. There's a couple of critical issues up now. I think it's really just a push to really try to get more people involved in helping get this ready.
Well, it's finally here. So, I mean, if you haven't jumped into Drupal 8, I mean, there's really nothing stopping you now other than your lack of wanting to do it, really. So I think beta 15 or 14 was the one that was a great step forward in terms of allowing people to do updates to their code, to upgrade to new versions, and now RC1 is out. So we're probably a short time away from this thing actually being a real live, what do we call that when it's a real live product?
A release?
The first release, right? So we get a release candidate, so then we'd have a real release. So I imagine that's not too far away. Although there's some critical bugs that keep showing up on the Drupal 8 page, but I guess we'll work through those. So yeah, not a lot of fanfare, but it's here. So so time to get moving. Have you guys done anything substantial with Drupal 8 yet, or have your companies decided to do any projects with Drupal 8?
I actually think we sent out a proposal for a Drupal 8 site recently, and I personally have installed it. I'm going to try to use it for my underwhelming personal website, and Surprisingly, I installed it. The install was very easy. Did not have any problems with Drupal. Turns out that my server and my hosting is becoming more of an issue than actual Drupal. So I'm playing around with it, which is exciting, and it's fun. It's fun to get in there and see what's new and different, and to be able to start using it and potentially start using it on production sites.
So we're currently working with a couple of Drupal 8 guys to put together a Drupal 8 series for the show. So it'll probably be in our next show. We'll have an announcement that we have 8 episodes coming out that will be focused solely on Drupal 8. Probably half of those being focused on the front end, site building stuff, and then 4 of those episodes being focused on developer kind of things. So we're looking forward to putting the final details of that together and getting these episodes out to you guys soon. So let's move on to one other topic. So an update. We had our recent New England Drupal camp. It was on October 10th and 11th, the second New England Drupal camp, and it was a big success.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun at Brown University, and a bunch of people showed up, which is always good for Drupal camp. We kicked off the day pretty early and went pretty late into the night. Holly Ross gave a great keynote, and there were some really good talks. People had a lot of very positive feedback and really seemed to enjoy themselves, even straight up to the after party, which was right down the street from Brown. We had a good time talking with everybody and catching up. We also did, for the first time this year, a second day training, which was new and really cool. I get to sit in on the Drupal 8 module training. It was great to see, kind of get in there and see how modules are going to be built and how different that's going to be compared to Drupal 7. So it was a great learning experience all around, and I think everybody had a good time. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it was bigger and better than last year. It's always good to improve, and we've already had our first retrospective meeting and going to start planning next year. So
yeah, it's amazing how quick we had the camp on Saturday and Sunday, and then on the following Friday we had a wrap-up meeting and our first deliverables for 2016. I mean, time goes by quickly. 12 months is not a lot of time.
yeah, no, it's a lot of work too. So
Yeah, so it was good fun. We had Holly Ross come in from the Drupal Association. She's the executive director, and she gave the keynote and attended the sessions during the day and was interactive with everyone. It was really great to have her there. And I'd encourage anyone who's putting a Drupal camp together to reach out to the Drupal Association. They have some great people that can come out and do keynotes and get involved.
yeah, it was a good day. And if you are looking to catch up on some of the talks that you missed, people are putting slides up. You can certainly read the summaries that people put together. And then today's show is going to be a recap of one of the talks. So as we said, today's show is about learning to code. And for those of you that listen to the show regularly, you know that over the last year I've become a much more proficient coder in Drupal. About a year and a half ago, I was an advanced site builder. I could build most anything in Drupal using modules, but if it needed something custom done, I found myself drowning. And over the last year, I've built up those skills, and I gave a talk on what my path was to try to help people save some time in that process. And I'm just going to very quickly go over the top level points, and then we'll go into detail. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you find a mentor. It's probably the most important thing. Then you want to have a place where you can look up information, and I recommend something like IRC, the Drupal IRC channel. Then you need to just really get to know Drupal hooks. I mean, if you've ever looked at starting to code, you'll know you've heard the term hooks, but you need to understand what they do and why you need to use them. You absolutely need to use an IDE. You can't, you don't want to be writing this in Notepad or Notepad++. You need to have a full-scale IDE, and then you need to have the right tools with that IDE. We'll get into some of those, and of course, you need to actually have real, use cases. You need to practice. If you only write 10 lines of code a year, you're gonna have trouble keeping these skills sharp.
Yeah, Nick, it's a good overview, and it's been fun to watch your journey into someone who wasn't coding and just doing module configuration to someone who now is doing coding, because I was only a few steps ahead of you in terms of doing that journey myself, and I think some of the points we're going to hit in this show and what you did in the things you hit in your talk last week or 2 weeks ago at New England Drupal Camp were really spot on and encouraging for people to really get started. So let's go through these. I think we get six key points here. Let's hit the first one.
So mentoring is an interesting first step, and I think it's really an important one. And the reason I say that is because nobody really learns anything through osmosis, right? Nobody is just born knowing. The internet is a vast sea of information, and it's a great place to find answers to questions. But in reality, being able to talk to somebody and to learn from somebody that has the experience is super valuable. So, I think mentoring as a first step, or finding a mentor as a first step, is really really important. I've always been a big, being a child of two teachers, I've always been a big proponent of mentoring and trying to give back as much as I can. That's why I teach to basically HTML and CSS to college kids, because I think mentoring is important. But here Nick's talking more about finding a mentor. How do you find a mentor? Where can you find a mentor? So my question is, Nick, I'm assuming when you went down this path, you found a mentor, and I'd be interested to hear how you went about doing that.
Well, I mean, there's a couple ways you could do that. I'd say in the Drupal community, if you're in a larger company, you can always find somebody that's more senior and speak to them. And if you're a freelancer like myself, I can't recommend going to a meetup or a Drupal camp enough. That's where I met all the mentors, all the people that I consider a mentor. And then sometimes it's just finding a project to work together. I mean, I consider Steven a mentor in the coding aspect because I started working with him on the food truck site, and I feel he basically held my hand through the first couple of modules, and then I get to the point where I was able to just kind of ask a couple questions. But don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to be explicit and say, "Hey, would you be willing to mentor me on this particular issue?" And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the same person for every single type of thing you're going through. But don't be afraid to ask.
So I mean, I think you're saying you could definitely have mentors in different subject areas. So for example, before the show we were talking about you're learning chef right now from somebody, and that person happens to be an expert in that. If you're working on commerce, you may go find a mentor in that area. And I would tend to agree with Nick. I think local meetups and Drupal events are a great way to find people that are experts in this industry and that would be more than willing to kind of share their knowledge. I'm also a big proponent of myself, working for a larger company. We have a lot of really smart developers and Drupal people that work for us, and sometimes you just need that other person to bounce an idea off of, or you need that that senior developer to be able to say, oh, you really shouldn't do a bunch of if statements here. A switch case is going to work better for you. So asking questions is definitely a big part of mentorship. You can't find somebody or have somebody as a resource or a mentor and then not ask the questions if you have them. So I think that's probably a big part of it as well.
So there's another side to mentoring, is not just finding a mentor, but being a mentor for other people. So, I mean, you can always offer your time and your expertise to other people to mentor them. And to be a mentor, you only need to know a little bit more than the person you're mentoring, by the way. So we're all experts at something, and to be an expert, you just need to know more than the person that is trying to learn something. So you can teach them what you know. So a mentor doesn't have to be someone who is the most knowledgeable person ever about Drupal and has done the most things ever. It's only someone that can guide you in terms of what they've done to help you, in a certain way and help you grow a little bit. So the other side of this is offer your services to people if they're trying to learn something and grow. Be there for them as well.
And I think the interesting thing here too is, we're talking about going to Drupal events and meeting mentors, but I don't know that you really need to meet your mentors, face to face. I mean, we're all connected by this thing called the internet, and there are a bunch of people that I've met through this show and in other venues that I've probably never met in real life. And I think the next topic is IRC, and I think that can be a big part of it, and also an area where you could find some sort of mentorship.
Yeah, and that's a good point. You don't necessarily, if you're in an area where there's not a lot of Drupal face-to-face activity, IRC is a great way to get connected to the Drupal community. And it's also a great way to very easily help out. If you've ever used IRC for anything technical, it can be really intimidating. You'll end up seeing a lot of people just saying you should read the manual, why you're asking such a simple question. The Drupal community is very much an exception to that. The Drupal community is very, very welcoming. People are very willing to help out with problems that you have. I've had people, when I was first starting out, I've had people jump on a hangout with me for an hour to help me figure something out. I even had somebody create a YouTube video once to show me how to do something. It's just, the main rule is be polite, don't demand answers. If somebody doesn't give you an answer right away, don't be impatient. It could be, and don't ping people directly. Try to solve your problem first, and then state what you've done, and people will help you out. And then while you're waiting, this is a good way to get into mentorship on the other side. While you're waiting, if somebody asks a question that you know the answer to, give them the answer. And the more active you are, the more likely people will respond when you have a question or problem. There's a couple of different Drupal channels. There's a general Drupal channel where you can talk about anything Drupal. There's a Drupal Contribute, which is more for helping contribute to core. And then there's a bunch of specific ones. Like there's one for COD, there's one for commerce. But getting started out, I would definitely look at the the Pound Drupal channel.
I've never had a bad experience on IRC. I'm not on there a ton, but my experiences have been always great when I've had a question. Recently, I needed some support with Stripe. This isn't a Drupal thing, but they have an IRC channel that the Stripe developers are sitting on, and they'll answer your questions like they will on the Drupal channels very quickly in a really courteous way. So there's a page somewhere out in Drupal, if you just search for Drupal IRC, that will give you the instructions on really how to get started right from the very beginning. So there's some etiquette things and some standards with IRC that I'm not sure I completely understand them all, but it's a great resource.
Definitely.
All right. So the next thing, number 3 things to. So we've talked about get a mentor, get connected with IRC or other places to get help online, and the next thing is to understand what a hook is. So we're primarily talking about Drupal 7 right here for this conversation. And a hook in Drupal is a place for you to insert some code. So, for example, whenever a node is saved in Drupal, Drupal will make a call to a hook. So you can actually write a custom module that basically says on the save of a node, please call my function when you create a hook function, and your code will be executed. So an example why you might want to do that is if you have some calculated fields or some other processing that needs to be done whenever a node is saved, you can create a hook and then write some additional code to make that happen. So hooks are the key to getting started with writing custom code in Drupal. Nick, do you have any particular tips with hooks that helped you out when you started to do this stuff? Is there anything that jumps out to you?
Yeah, one of the things that really kind of turned on the light bulb for me is that a hook tells Drupal when to do your code. So if you write a custom module and just put a bunch of functions in there, nothing is going to happen because Drupal doesn't know when they're supposed to use that. But as soon as you add a hook, Drupal looks at a list of things that it needs to do. So if you add, for example, a hook form alter, when Drupal goes to do something with a form, it says, oh, hey, is there anything telling me to do something when I look at this form? And then it sees your hook form alter and then takes that and executes whatever code you've put in there. So the hooks are really, all it is just telling Drupal when your code should be executed. So it's about inserting your code into some point, whether that's on a page load, on a node save, on a node delete. There's tons of hooks, but the ultimate thing is when you're looking for a hook to use, you're thinking about when your code should be executed.
And one of the interesting things is that's not so obvious when you're looking at the documentation online. If you just do a simple Google search on like Drupal hooks, or that would get you stuff, or Drupal form API, you'll get a list of hooks. Whenever you see documentation that has the word hook, HOOK underscore, with a function like form alter, so we say hook form alter, the word hook really is a placeholder for you putting your module name in there. So if I create a module called Steven, that's my local module, my hook for the form alter would be called Steven underscore form alter. The word hook is always a placeholder when you're looking at documentation. And that's one of the mistakes I made early on. I'm sticking this function out there called hook form alter when it really should have been the name of my module form alter. It's a little bit of a tip when you're looking at the documentation. So
yeah, it's it can be a little tricky, but it's once you start understanding the different types of hooks that are out there, it gets a little easier to find what you're looking for.
So what are some of the hooks, Nick, that you'd say, and John, that you'd say you use most often, or like a common hooks that you create a custom module for things to do?
I'd probably say the top 4 or 5 are hook form alter,
which basically says whenever a form is displayed on the page, you can hook into the display of that form and modify the form by changing a form element on the screen, by deleting one or adding one before the form is displayed to the user.
Yeah,
it's really key.
Exactly. And then the next, another one that's very common is hook menu alter, which allows you to add actions to add a menu item, basically. So you say with the hook menu alter, when this page is visited, run this function. Another big one is hook validate. Hook validate, again, is with forms. it allows you to run some sort of validation. So if you have some sort of requirement where two fields have to be equal and within a certain range, you can put that code in there and check it when it's submitted. And then there's a hook node pre-save, which lets you do something before a node is saved. And I think those are the main ones that I use. There's a couple of others that are fairly common relating to permissions. And I occasionally, I really don't like to use it, but I occasionally use hook init. So if you have something that needs to happen pretty much on every single
Page load, yeah.
Like that's the only way to get it. You have to be very careful when implementing that one because it loads on every single page. Right. And you can end up with problems where, in fact, I am having this issue right now. I'm trying to figure it out. If you have a situation where Drupal is loading more than one page, then it will run that code more than once. And an example of where this happens is if you're using the Simple Adds module, it is doing an AJAX call and reloading Drupal and bootstrapping it again. So if you have some sort of code that runs when Drupal initializes, it's going to show up twice on that page.
It's interesting because all of the hook functions that you've mentioned, I've used at one point or another, but I think the real winner for me is not so much one particular function, but like the api.drupal.org website, because Drupal has a huge API, has all these functions that you can pull in and you can do amazing things with, but it's hard to remember all of them, and it's great to be able to go to that website, start typing like a word. Like, oh, user. Oh, okay, here we go. User login. This will tell me when, a Drupal user is logging in, or it'll do something when the Drupal user is logging in. So I think, that website is very, very important, very useful. There are functions there that I've, kind of stumbled across that have been exactly what I need to solve a problem that I'm having. So, yeah, I would say that. To be honest, Nick touched on some great stuff, but I think that website's really the kind of silver bullet when it comes to finding a function or just figuring out what a function does.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's also a counterpart for contributed modules. I believe it's called Drupal Contrib. We'll have it in the show notes. But I think it's called drupalcontrib.org, and it will have hooks that are provided by Drupal modules, because a module can provide that as well. For example, a big module that does that is like the Entity API. They provide a bunch of hooks. The Commerce module provides a bunch of stuff. So none of that is on the api.drupal.org. It's all on drupalcontrib.org. So we'll have links to both of those in the show notes, and yeah, they're both great resources.
So just to be clear, like using a hook is the accepted way and the approved way to modify the functionality of what's happening on your site, as opposed to going in and touching the code of the contributed module or the core code itself. The hooks is the place for you to customize the functionality. I did want to bring up one other one. Nick had a list of a few things that he uses all the time. Another one that I love is the cron. It escapes my memory. It's called a drush. Sorry, not cron. Drush command. So you can actually, if you write a function in a custom module, you can call it from drush by calling the hook called hook drush command, adding your function to the commands that drush will run, and you can actually run your code from the drush command line. So for doing things like updating lots of database records or doing some sort of maintenance functions, it's a great way to do it. It's one of my favorites.
There's one caveat there. You do need to add a blank file
in your yeah.
In the module, and it's the module name .drush.inc, I believe.
Yeah, it's modulename.drush.inc.
And that will tell
that tells Drush to go look for the
Drush command.
The Drush command, right? Okay, so we've just covered.
Yeah, so we're at the point where you have a mentor. You're on IRC for any incidental questions that you have. You know which hook you want to write, and you're ready to sit down writing code. You don't want to necessarily be using Vim or Gedit or Notepad or whatever the equivalent is on a Mac. At this point, you really need something that's full-featured. I personally use something called IntelliJ. It's similar to PHP Storm. Many Drupal developers use PHP Storm. You can also use something like NetBeans. There's tons of IDEs out there. But what you're really looking for is something that provides something similar to linting. What that means is it will tell you if you're writing PHP and you miss the syntax, it will basically spell check your code. Like, hey, you're missing a semicolon here, or you have a space in the variable name. Like it will alert you to some low-level bugs, so that before you even run the code, it will tell you. And then it also generally integrates with your source control. You can integrate it sometimes with your server, and then as you see in the next couple of things, it gives you access to many other tools. There's no specific right IDE to use. It's just you need something that can handle that understands the code. You want more than just something that highlights the syntax. I think another thing that's really useful, and the one in particular I use, is that it has some inline Drupal documentation. So if you start writing a hook, it will come up with the possible options. So, for example, if you can't remember if hook node pre-save, if pre-save is one word or not, if you just start typing hook node _, it will show you pre-save or save or options, and you could choose the one that's correct, and then it will tell you which arguments it's expecting it. So it gives you information as you're writing the code about what you're doing, and then it also does that for variables. So if you declare a variable in your function, and then you start typing that variable further down, it will pop up an autocomplete for you if you want to. So that way, it helps prevent simple typos from ruining your code.
It really saves you time, doesn't it?
It's
saves tons of time.
Saver.
Yeah.
There are free ones. Some of them cost money. The one that I have, I paid for, but it's worth every penny.
Nick, what did you say you're using?
It's IntelliJ. It's put out by JetBrains. They do PHP Storm as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say. I think they're all the same product, aren't they?
No,
like,
it's
Storm,
different.
JetBeans and
No.
JetBrains and they're not all the same. They're all from the same core system, aren't they?
Yeah, they're from the same company. It's slightly different.
Okay.
The big difference is the platform. PHP Storm doesn't work very well on Ubuntu. IntelliJ does.
All right.
And it's a little bit more expensive.
Yeah.
I think PHP Storm you can get for $100. I think this one is $250. Although JetBrains is changing their pricing, so if you're looking at it, be aware that they're going to a yearly license fee or something. But highly recommend an IDE.
Yeah, huge change for me when I decided to jump into getting out of just a general coding tool and into an IDE. Made just great changes, and they're also usually integrated into Git. So if you're using that, you can see like check-in status, and you can look right in the IDE and understand where things are situated in Git. So there's just tons and tons of features. I often think that I should take like some sort of course at some point to fully understand all the capabilities I have in PHP Storm, because I'm probably using 10% of them.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it's a little overwhelming at first. There are hundreds of buttons and 3 or 4 window panes, and then you'll accidentally click somewhere and you'll get this new pane that you've never seen before. and have no idea if it's helpful or not, and then occasionally you'll accidentally click on something and get a pain and go, oh, you know what? I wish I'd known about that for the last 6 months. That's really useful. And it does another really useful thing actually that we should bring up very briefly is it allows you to very quickly search on functions. So, for example, you can highlight a function and allows you to search for function calls, and we'll say like you're using this function 10 times in this file, and this file over here. And you can navigate through the file structure of your project, but once you're in a file, you can also just open up the structure, and it will show you a list of all the different functions in the particular file. So if you have a file that's maybe 500, 600, 700 lines long, rather than having to scroll to see what's in it, you can just very quickly see what functions are there.
So one of the things that got me into using an IDE initially, back a number of years ago, was using a debugging tool, and I think that is one of the best things you could do as a Drupal developer is to learn how to debug stuff within an IDE, and I'm particularly talking about XDebug. So, and that's the reason that I started using an IDE, because I wanted to get my hands on a debugger. So, XDebug is a tool that integrates with a lot of IDEs. But what it really does is, when you're executing your PHP code, it allows you to put breakpoints into the code, and while the application is running, while your website's running, you can stop at certain points and just take a look at what's going on. And what I mean by what's going on is you get a window inside of your IDE that will show you all of the variables, what they're currently set to, all of the arrays that you have access to, the input parameters from the function that you're on, and you can really easily see what your issues are and what's happening at the code at that point. And then you can step through your code one line at a time if you want to.
One thing to note there, Steve, and it's maybe kind of obvious, but I think I think we should point it out anyway. You have to be running a local version of your site in order for XDebug to work, or is that not necessarily true? Are there server components you can install to get it to work?
Yeah, they have remote debugging as part of. I've never used it, never tried to because I don't need to. I'm not sure if you've ever tried it, Nick, but there is remote debugging that you can turn on.
Yeah, it's generally easier to do it locally because you set it up once and it's done. So, but if you're not able to, there are ways to set up remotely. I would not want to be the one trying to set that up, though.
Yeah, I've never tried to do it, but I know it exists.
Yeah, it's probably not too complex, but.
That's interesting. I also would not want to try to set it up remotely. That's why I thought the having it locally caveat was a good one. But
no, I think it's the way you should start with it. Absolutely. I've never really had a need to do remote debugging, but I know it exists. Never tried it. So, what some of the values of this, and I know that when people start doing like Drupal development, they use the Devel module, which is great. We can talk about that more in a minute. And it gives you, in the website, a lot of capabilities. But what people end up doing is they end up printing stuff to the page, printing variables to the screen, and looking at things in the web page that give you additional information, which is handy until you discover XDebug. Once you discover XDebug, I don't even use Devel anymore. Like, the only time I ever turn Devel on is, and shame on me for doing this, but I turn it on a live site when I can't run my XDebugger to figure something out. I never even use Devel anymore locally because I don't need it. Once I discovered XDebug, when I'm sitting inside some code, I have access to everything that I would have access to in XDebug. You don't even, or I'd have access to in Devel, so I don't even use it anymore. And when you start coding and doing some of this module development, one of the things that you'll learn as a struggle is to figure out, how do I write the code to access a particular element in an array that is 10 levels deep? You're trying to get update a certain value. Well, when you're sitting in XDebug, you can actually just click on the thing you're trying to get to and say, hey, I'd like to copy, do a copy, and it will give you exactly what that string is that you need to stick in your code to update that variable. Instead of looking at devel and trying to figure that out from looking at the structure it gives you, in something like XDebug, you can just copy it and paste it right into your code. It's a huge, huge time saver.
Yeah, and I mean, I still use devel sometimes. I think sometimes it's easier to just turn that on and look at the structure than it is to insert something in the code that will interrupt when you need to. But more often than not, I'm using XDebug to get the structure and find out where it is. But I still find sometimes it's quicker. Like if, for example, you're grabbing information from the user, sometimes it's easier just to turn it on, visit the user page, and see what the structure is, and then do what you need to do. But XDebug works too.
Yeah, so it's a matter of your habit. But Nick, what would you say is the amount of time once you started using XDebug that you save in terms of just writing code? Is it 30% of your time?
Really, it's not even about saving time. It's about, like, you can't do it without XDebug, really, because XDebug gives you the ability to see, like, you'll just be floundering there, randomly changing stuff, hoping it works, and not actually understanding if anything is working, if it's actually working correctly or not. XDebug allows you to see, where in the code something is going wrong.
You'll understand Drupal a whole lot better too when you start using XDebug. As you start stepping through the code.
Yeah, if that's one thing.
It's an eye opener when you realize, oh my God, there's hundreds of functions that are getting called.
Yeah,
every time a page loads, there's hundreds of things happening, and it gives you appreciation for really what's going on here.
Yeah, if you accidentally rather than hit go to next breakpoint, jump into the next function, you'll end up in a rabbit hole of Bootstrap and menu and 10,000 other files, and it will take you a good 20 minutes of clicking to get back to get to the end of it.
And what's super helpful with it too is, like, so we all get these every once in a while where we see an error message in PHP log file that says, in this obscure .inc file at this line, there's an issue there. You can actually open up that file, stick a breakpoint there, run the application, stop there, and have a look at what's going on. And that will often give you some insight into why that is happening for you. And really a shortcut way of trying to fix those problems.
XDebug takes a little bit to set up. It's not, but there's generally very good documentation out there. It doesn't take that long, and it really is indispensable once you start coding.
So we probably can't talk about that enough, so we won't anymore. So the other tool to mention we've already done is Devel. If you're not using that, it's a contributed module that if you turn it on in development, it gives you lots of information. All kinds of places within Drupal that you can get more information, like what is like a query, how is a query actually developed, all of the structures of the arrays for any node that you're looking at. You have some functions you have access to that allow you to display stuff within a page. That's useful information. So if you're not using Devel, it's really probably something you should take a look at. When you start developing, you're going to need at least that if you're not going to go down the XDebug and IDE route.
And never use it in production.
Oh, that was my one addition to that. Darn, you stole it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a memory hog and a resource hog. So stay away from it. Don't leave it on in a live site. But I got to be honest with you, most of the sites that I have it disabled, but I keep the module there because it's a great debugging tool on a live site. If you can't reproduce a problem, in a development environment or a local environment, having Devel available to you to flip on for 20 minutes is helpful sometimes. So I don't know, do you guys uninstall it or do you keep it there like I do and turn it on when you need it?
I can ignore it so it doesn't get put up there in the first place.
Yeah, that's usually what we do. This is probably a much broader question, but is Devel a security risk if it's on a production site?
I think it can be. It depends on the permissions, though. Maybe not.
Do you mean if it's there or if it's enabled?
Well, if it's enabled, I mean, if it's there, it's just sitting there. It's not really doing anything. But I'm talking about enabled.
I don't know. I'm not sure of that.
Yeah.
I know it's a resource hog, so I think that's the reason to turn it off. I'm not sure it's a security problem.
Okay, and that brings us to our last point.
Yeah, so we've talked about these. Well, this will be the 6th point, but we've talked about 5 points to this point, and the last point really is to just get out there and do it. Here it says practice, 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 but I wasn't going to try to make a Carnegie Hall joke out of it. But yeah, get out there and just do it. And when I saw this list of points and the last one being practice, I kind of went back to before I worked for Oomph. I wasn't a big fan of the command line. I used Rush and it was helpful, but I didn't do a ton of stuff via command line. And one of my goals while at Oomph was to try to get better at the command line. So I basically got a really awesome, terminal application. I use iTerm with a special theme and whatnot, but I kind of immersed myself in it and kind of forced myself to learn how to do things via the command line as opposed to either clicking around in Drupal or using a server admin tool like Flask, and it really helped out. So just practicing, and don't be afraid of it. Just jump right into it. Is really important.
Yeah, and don't do it on a live site. Always have a development environment when you're coding.
Oh God, yes. No, don't ever practice on the live site.
I think we should at least mention that once.
So there's lots of tools, well, not tools, but blog posts and tutorials out there that if you just type into Google like create module in Drupal, you'll see lots of tutorials on how to create your first custom module, the basic steps you need to do, and some tips. I mean, there's tons of information out there. It's just a matter of just deciding to go ahead and do it.
And I think a lot of it can be also real-world practice. So you have a client that has an issue, and we'll talk about real-life problems in a little bit, but I think, the practice thing dovetails with real life scenarios perfectly because the best way to get practice is to have a real life scenario where you're like, oh, I need to change this label on this field and I can't get to it via the UI. How am I going to do this? Oh, I need to use a hook form alter, or I need to edit the menu before it gets displayed to the page. Based on this random criteria, how am I going to do that? Oh, I can use a menu alter. I think having those real world kind of scenarios can definitely help you get into the code and start using these functions and building custom modules, or even just putting code into your template.php file to get you where you need to be. So I think that's also a very important point to bring up as far as practicing.
Definitely.
So
Go ahead, Jen.
I was just gonna say, going into coming out of practicing and talking about real life problems, I'd love to hear some of the ways that you guys have kind of used code to solve real world issues as opposed to finding a module or clicking around on some buttons.
Yeah, so I'll start with this. Try to keep it brief. I had a client that has a website where they post a listing, and they need the person posting they need the listing to expire at some point between the next 1 and 3 months, and they needed the ability for an administrator to be able to come in and override the expiration. But the person posting the listing, once they choose that expiration date, they're not allowed to override that. So there's a couple of modules that get us most of the way there, but not quite. There is, of course, the date module. There's a module called date restriction. The date restriction module allows you to have specific times that can be selected, so you can restrict it between 1 and 3 months. There's the publisher module, or the schedule module, which lets you schedule and publishing. The problem is that module is in the admin section, and if you give somebody access to it, they can change it at any point. So I was able to write a very short module. I think it's less than 20 lines, and what it does is when it uses the hook node pre-save, checks to make sure that it's the content type, and when that listing is being saved, it checks to see if there's a value in the unpublished field, and if there isn't, it sets the value from a date field that it provided to the user and sets that as the unpublished date. So when the user's creating the listing, they choose a date. It's called, expire listing date or something. They choose that, and the first time the content is saved, it saves that into the unpublished date. Then using the field permissions module, I just restrict their access to it after that, so they never see it again. Then if the admin comes in later, they have access to the unpublished, scheduled unpublished, so they can change it if they need to. And since the module checks to see if it's filled first, if they change it, it doesn't get overwritten. So it's something that I think you could probably do with rules, but would be very complex. But with a little bit of knowledge about coding, I was able to write that module in about 20 minutes or so, and it's at less than 20 lines, I think.
And Nick, one of the things you just mentioned is you could probably do it in rules, and it took a lot less time, or it only took so many lines by writing a custom module. I think once you start writing some custom modules, I think you'll be looking to rules a lot less.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't use rules that much anymore unless they already come configured from a module.
Right. So I have an example of a way to use custom code, a little bit different. It's related to web form. So I have a website that is a web form, and when the data collected from the user filling out the web form is like maybe 10 fields, but there's a lot of other data that's required to make that form useful for the administrator to process that form later. And it's information about the context, like who the user is, some of the entities they're connected to, and that kind of stuff. So a way to handle it, the way I did it was I created a number of hidden fields in the form. And then what happens is when the form gets saved, I use a hook called hook web form submission pre-save. And I basically, in that hook, have access to all the elements that the user just entered. And then I can do some other background work. I look up some other entities. I grab some other data that the user who's processing the form, the admin processing the form later, could use to make their job easier. And I fill in another 15 fields of content in that hook. So when the form gets saved, they had the original 10 pieces of data that the user filled in, has another 10 that I put into that element, and when they export the form to process in a spreadsheet later, they have all of the information they need to action on that form. So it's a really useful hook, and I've taken advantage of it in a lot of places.
I'll have to remember that one.
What was that? Was that Nick?
I'll have to remember that one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So I actually have an instance where I not so much built a module, but I was in a views template, and I was trying to export, or I was trying to display a different subset of child items based on the parent, and this is basically could be achieved in views and was achieved in views to an extent. Um, but the issue came in when we were trying to get children of a certain with a certain parent and getting those to display in a certain way within a view. And I could have gone through and kind of used an attachment and tried to configure it that way. But in reality, a views template really was a lot easier. It was a lot easier to write it in code and to kind of surround it in the HTML markup that we wanted, and then just drop our view in where need be. So a lot of coding can be done not so much in modules, but within your theme, within your template files, within your template.php file. So that's another place where you can keep that in mind, and where we've kind of inserted some custom code.
Yeah, it's you'll find that many modules give you access to do things before something saves, before is displayed, after it's saved, after it's displayed, after it's been updated or deleted. There's there's common patterns with contributed modules and what kind of access points you get. So we've been talking about coding. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the anatomy of the module, how the modules get put together. They're pretty straightforward. I'm going to go through the different files that you can have kind of quickly, because there's tons of great blog posts on this. Essentially, to have a module in Drupal, you need two different files at the core. One is a .info file. .info tells Drupal information about the module. So it tells Drupal what the name of the module is, where it should be grouped, what the version of the module is, if it has any module dependencies. Sometimes if you're adding include files, it tells you what files are included, and a couple other things like that. The important thing is the name, the short name, so it has to be something like nick_module.info, and that nick_module is the short name, and that's something that you're using when you're implementing a hook or writing other files. The second module that you need, which is also important, is the module file, and that's generally where you put most of your code. Depending on what how big the module is, you might break up and add an include file or something else, but the module file is the one that's running when the module is being used. There's also a .install file. You don't always need this, but this lets you do things like if your module needs to create a database table, you would create the table in the install file. It's also where updates are generally created. So if you have a version 1 and you're coming out with version 1.1 and something needs to change with the database table, you need to change the schema, add an additional field, you handle that in the install file. And then we've already mentioned the drush file. So if you want to be able to integrate with drush, you need to use the drush hook, and then you have to have an empty short module name .drush.inc, and it will be available. And so that's the basic structure. You have at the core, you just need the info in the module, and depending on what you're doing, you may need an install, drush, or an include.
I first learned how to do, so my mentor was modules buildamodule.com. So we talked about mentors earlier. I had a technology mentor, so I used buildamodule.com, went through their tutorials in a weekend on module development a couple of years ago, and that's really what launched me. And they go through this entire process here. And I know there's other services and blog posts that do the same thing, but I can't. I couldn't recommend Build a Module strong enough to say this is a great way to learn how to do this kind of stuff. So the last little tip here is just a couple of quick tips on things if you're starting to look at doing some custom development. Some things you really need to look at, pay attention to. One is entity field query. It's a function that allows you to access content, kind of like writing a view through code. I hate to say it like that, but it's really for Drupal people that might make more sense to them. So if you create a view that delivers certain elements to you, you can use entity field query to access data in a PHP program and function. A few other things that you should look at as well, I think, is Entity API, which allows you to create, delete, update entities in Drupal. And some functions that are always used would be like load node, or node load, and user load, things that you'll use often when you start writing custom code.
Just a couple quick things. The entity field query is provided by the Entity API, and there's also node load multiple, and I believe user load multiple. So if you're trying to load more than one node at a time, it's better to use that.
Yeah, could you just give it an array, or do you give it a comma-separated list of node IDs? How does that work?
I believe it's an array of node IDs.
Yeah.
Same thing with the user, I would
You
imagine.
have to be very, very careful with that stuff with multiple loads. So and whenever you think in loading something into an array, think of that you're taking up memory on the machine. So it'd be very easy to do a entity field query, get a list of node IDs of all your nodes in the system, and then use node load multiple and load every single node into an array.
I don't know anybody that's done
Not
that.
a great idea. No, you don't know anyone, huh, Nick? Yeah, it's an easy thing to do because your code works when you're testing it, and then when you put it in production against 30,000 records, things slow down very quickly. Not doing stuff like that. So you need to be careful, but what you'll quickly see is if you use these functions to access Drupal, you're doing it the right way. It's exactly what you should be doing, and you can get a lot of power in terms of doing stuff this way.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's recap quickly. We've got if you haven't started coding in Drupal, it's the time to do it. Everyone who's doing Drupal work should be doing some level of this stuff at some point. Get familiar with it. Find a mentor. Connect to IRC for support and questions. Learn what the hook system is. Get yourself an IDE, a free or paid one. Use XDebug. Use Devel. And code. Just try it. You jump in, solve a problem through code instead of installing another module. And just give it a whirl.
Absolutely.
Give it a whirl is definitely the takeaway from this show.
Give it a whirl, exactly. All right, so let's talk about the module of the week.
Man, the module of the week is a module I've actually been using quite a bit in the last couple of weeks with a client of ours. It's Workbench, and you can find that on Drupal.org/workbench. And Workbench basically provides overall improvements for managing content that Drupal does not provide out of the box. So what does that mean? Workbench is basically an API for handling content, and gives you the ability to do some pretty interesting things. So Workbench itself doesn't really do anything. It's the related modules that kind of give you the ability to do kind of different things with your content. So what do I mean by different things with your content? Essentially, there's Workbench, and then there are related modules or submodules, which are Workbench Access, Workbench Moderation, Workbench Files, and Workbench Media. And the Workbench Access basically gives you the ability to moderate access or grant different access permissions to different users. The one I've been using and what I'm really going to kind of focus on here is Workbench Moderation. We've had a client that has needed editorial workflow and moderation of their content, and we implemented Workbench for them. And what it basically provided us was a easy way to implement a couple modules and give them the ability to have different states for their content. So let me just give an example here of a website where I'm adding a blog post. So I go in as somebody that is under the moderation control, and I go in and I create content. When I create that content, I get it the way I like it. It looks good to me. I hit, save draft, send it off for review. Well, what then happens is a moderator logs into the system and it says, hey, you have these things to review, one of which is my blog post. I can go in and look at the blog post as a moderator and say, okay, this person made this mistake, that mistake, and I can either fix it or kick it back to them with comments. Hey, fix this, fix that, or I can edit it, correct the issues, and publish it myself. So what
John,
this does,
John, what does kick back to them mean in this scenario?
So basically, you can send it back and say, hey, this needs more work, or there are more edits that need to be made here. And basically, it stays in that draft state. So what you're doing is you're creating the draft. The draft is being sent for review, and then you're kicking it back to the draft state, saying, "Hey, this isn't done yet. It needs
Is the
more,
user getting
more
some
work."
sort of notification or something that?
Not out of the box. You can set it up so that they can get notifications using Nick's favorite module, rules. You can fire off emails.
Or custom coding.
Yeah, we'll have a debate about that at a later date. But it's really easy when you log in and you have Workbench. You get like this My Workbench tab that you can go to, and it kind of shows you what you have and what's going on with the content that you're working on. So it makes it pretty easy that if you know that you have something that's off from review, if you log in, you can see it very, very quickly and easily. So it's just a great way to be able to interface with the system and create an editorial workflow for your content.
I mean, it does. It's a very powerful module or set of modules. It's important to test very rigorously. There's a lot of permissions, and it's very easy.
Ton of permissions.
It maybe not very easy, but it's possible to create dead endpoints where you can moderate something into a specific state, and then you can't get it out of that state. So it's important that you test all of the different roles and different states and make sure that there's a way for the item to get through the workflow appropriately.
You really have to that point. You really have to have a kind of a architecture to it so that okay, these 5 people have the ability to push something all the way through the workflow, and these 5 people do not, and these 5 people are just basically reviewing it or just basically creating it. So you have to be very cognizant of the permissions that you're giving people and how that impacts what they can do within the moderation workflow. But yeah, it's definitely very permission heavy. We went through, and the content that was in moderation was really just a couple of pages, but each one of those content types had probably about 10 permissions added to it. So it it ratchets up your permissions quite a bit.
It can be used. You can have a workflow that's different per content type if you want. So say a blog goes through a marketing review, and another page just goes through technical writer review. But you can also set up different levels of workflows where a user can send it off. A manager, for example, might be able to just publish something, or they can send it to, for example, the lawyers to review. So if they know it's something that doesn't have any impact, they can just publish it, or they can put it in the queue for a lawyer, and most things don't go that way. But then they can review it and publish it. So it's very powerful.
In the review process, are people looking at the published view of this content, or are they looking at the typical Drupal view tab, or the edit? How are they looking at this? Is it a preview mode that someone's editing, or are they just looking at the edit mode? You understand my question?
It's a revision.
Okay, all right. Okay, so they're looking at a revision.
So you can have a published.
So they're not looking at it in context of it being published.
Yeah, so it's more powerful than the preview. It's just a revision. So it's rendered. It can be in the theme. It'll just say, this is not the currently active revision. So you can have, for example, a marketing page that is up, and then you're getting ready to launch a new product, so you want to change it, and somebody can make some changes. That won't immediately go live. That particular revision has to go through the moderation and workflow while the older version stays live. It's similar to the revisioning module. It just gives you a lot more flexibility. But it's a lot of work to set up.
A lot of work to set up, but it sounds like it has some great benefits, though.
It's funny you say that, because once I got into it and I understood the different revision states and the different roles that we're going to have the ability to do what, and understood all the permission sets, it was really just install the modules, make sure the revision states were correct, and then set the permissions, and you were off to the races. So I think it can be very complex depending on your states and how many pieces of content you're doing, and if you're doing different workflows for each piece of content.
Yeah, it also depends on how you're handling access. If it's by like a taxonomy term, or if it's by workflow. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, but it's certainly one of those modules that if you need it, there's no other way to go.
So I'm looking here. I don't see is there a Drupal 8 version? No.
I don't think so.
So that's
a
question
beast.
That's the question we need to start asking all the time, right?
Yeah.
What is the Drupal 8 path here? And I don't see anything started with this at all.
Yeah,
you get T-shirts. Drupal 8. Is there a module for that?
All right. Yeah, so I don't see a Drupal 8 path started.
It's interesting. I mean, it's developed by, I believe, Palantir, which is...
Yeah, it is, yep. A little agency.
A little agency. Big company. So, yeah, so that's module of the week. Workbench. It's it's again very complicated, but if you need it, there's nothing better. And like John said, once you get past that initial learning curve, it's fairly straightforward. It just takes a lot of QA.
And it sounds like if you're having trouble with it, John's your guy to go to. He's not afraid of it.
Yeah, I'll be more than happy to help anybody out. Tweet me your questions.
That's right. John will be your Workbench mentor, right? Okay. All right, guys. We have reached the end of episode 106. John Picozzi, where can people find you online and reach out to you to be their mentor?
Oh, man. You can find me on Drupal.org and all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and always on at umthink.com.
Great. And Nick?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, Nicxvan. Feel free to tweet me or send me a question on Drupal.
Great. And I'm Stephen Cross. You can reach me on Twitter at Stephen Cross with a PH. And at my company website, always on at parallaxinfotech.com. Great, guys, and we'll talk in 2 weeks.
See you in a couple weeks.
Sounds good.
Take care. Bye.